Welcome everyone to Words, London's Literary and Creative Arts Festival. I'm Josh Lambier, the Artistic Director of Words, as well as the Director of the Public Humanities at Western, here at Western University. It is a special privilege to greet all of you tonight because we are hosting this event as part of a milestone for the Words Festival, namely our 10th anniversary celebration this year. I would like to thank all of you who joined us here in University College at Western University, as well as those of you who are joining us on the live stream on Zoom. I have you all beside me at home. I can see there's 70 of you on our live stream right now, and I read spaces like Vernon, BC, Woodstock, Sudbury, so all over Ontario, all over Canada, people joining us. So we're gonna bring you into the conversation with us. That's why I've got my laptop beside me today. So when we get to the question period, we'll hopefully be able to bring your questions in as well. So it's really, really terrific to have this capability so that we can have a discussion with people here in London, but also across Canada. As we all gathered today, I want to situate us in the territory on which this event is taking place. We're gathering just up from University College Hill, from the banks of Dashkan-Zibi, or Antler River, also known as the Thames, on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinookan peoples. The Huron-Wendat peoples also have a history of living in this territory. In the London area, there were Treaty 6 London Township, Treaty 7 Sombre Township, and Treaty 21 Longwoods, as well as the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and water and as vital contributors to our community, as well as the Words Festival. It's my honor to have the opportunity to host tonight's two distinguished guests, playwright Emil Sher, who is currently writing a play based on Max Eisen's book, By Chance Alone, and Professor Amanda Grzyb, who was crucial in shaping Max Eisen's memoir of surviving Auschwitz as a teenager. Indeed, Max Eisen had a story to tell about his experience as a Holocaust survivor. A story of courage, determination, and resilience, but Amanda Grzyb helped him find his voice. In March 2010, Max and Amanda met on the Simon Wiesenthal Center's inaugural mission to Poland. Eisen had been speaking as a Holocaust survivor educator for decades, but he could never put his experiences down on paper. They began to work in collaboration in 2012 to produce his story of survival as a teenager at the Auschwitz concentration camp. The book that emerged from their collaboration, By Chance Alone, a remarkable true story of courage and survival at Auschwitz, would be shortlisted for the RBC Taylor Prize for Nonfiction in 2017. And then the book would ultimately win Canada Reads in 2019. The theme of Canada Reads that year was One Book to Move You, and it was defended by Zaya Tong. Award-winning playwright Emil Sher is now in the process of giving another life to Max's memoir by adapting the book for the stage. Emil brings an experienced hand to the challenging task of transforming Max's story to the stage. Sher's adaptation of Hannah's Suitcase, the acclaimed Holocaust book by Karen Levine, has been staged across Canada, the US, and Israel. His adaptation of Ian Brown's The Boy in the Moon was also selected as a top 10 production of 2017 by the Globe and Mail. Over the next hour or so, Emil and Amanda are going to join us to talk about the process of turning Max's compelling story first into a book and then adapting his memoir into a play for the stage. So from page to stage, as they say. At the end, we're going to take your questions here in Conron Hall, as well as on the webinar's Q&A beside me. I would like to recognize the generous support of the Ontario Arts Council, the London Arts Council, Museum London, and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities, financial and organizational sponsors and supporters that afforded us to keep the festival free, largely free, during and beyond the pandemic. Our first guest tonight, Amanda Grzyb, is Professor of Information and Media Studies at Western, where her primary teaching and research interests include state violence, genocide studies, social movements, and memory studies. Her research focuses on El Salvador, Nazi-occupied Europe, Rwanda, and Sudan. Dr. Grzyb currently serves as the project director for Surviving Memory in Post-War El Salvador, a SSHRC-funded community-based research partnership initiative committed to documenting the history of the Salvadoran Civil War, commemorating massacres and preventing future violence. Emil Sher has written a wide-ranging works for the stage, screen, and print, including Sanctuary, Blue Nose, Derailed, Beneath the Banyan Tree, and The Book of Ashes. He has written acclaimed stage adaptations, including Hannah's Suitcase by Karen Levine and The Boy in the Moon by Ian Brown, which I mentioned earlier, both of which have been staged at the Grand Theatre here in London, Ontario. Young Man with Camera, Emil's debut young adult novel, was a 2015 Governor General's Award finalist. And his most recent book, I Love You More, illustrated by Barbara Reed, was a bestseller shortly after its release. Emil is co-writing a screenplay about the 60s scoop with director and 60s scoop survivor Tasha Hubbard. Please join me in welcoming our two guests, Amanda and Emil. Okay, so very sadly, we lost Max Eisen last year at the age of 93. Amanda, could you start us off? Could I ask you to talk about Max? We'll get into the process of working with him, but I thought a great place to begin would be to hear about the man behind this story.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks so much for the introduction, Josh. Tibor Max Eisen was born in Moldova nad Bavoh, Czechoslovakia in 1929. He grew up in a small town of 5,000 people. About 10% of the population was Jewish. The rest of the population were Catholic and Reformist Christian. And he grew up with a great deal of harmony in his community. He had Jewish friends, he had non-Jewish friends. The community was in many ways fairly integrated and peaceful. He lived in a large house with extended family members, so with his immediate family, with his aunts and uncles. There were 2 kitchens and a large fruit plantation. And after the Munich Agreement in 1938, many of you know Czechoslovakia was partitioned. So part of it became Slovakia, part was annexed by Nazi Germany. And Max lived in the area of Czechoslovakia that was annexed by Hungary. And so he quickly had to make the change from speaking Slovakian to speaking Hungarian, and came under the anti-Semitic laws that were instituted in Hungary in 1939. Very similar to the Nuremberg laws that were also instituted in Nazi Germany. In his memoir, he describes the increasing militarization of that region and the introduction of increasingly anti-Semitic laws, forced enrollment in labor battalions and Hungarian military battalions. Both his father and his uncle and many men in the community were sent off to participate on the front in support of the war effort. And he also recounts the deportations of his uncles and aunts and cousins who were on the other side of the border in Slovakia. So they were deported quite early during the Holocaust in 1942-43 to one of the 6 death camps called Majdanek in eastern Poland. By all accounts, although we don't have all of the records, that entire part of his extended family was murdered in Majdanek by the Nazis. In May of 1944, at the age of 15, Max was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau with his family, which included his mother, his father, his grandparents, 2 younger brothers, and his baby sister, Judith, who was around 9 months of age. Max and his father and his uncle were selected for slave labor by the Nazis, and the rest of his family were sent immediately to the gas chambers where they were killed. This is a really difficult point that he recounts in his memoir. And I know that when we were working on that section, you know, there was this desire of the reader and of Max himself to have a goodbye moment with his mother, and that simply never came. Things happened very swiftly. He remembers the last moment he saw his mother, but he wasn't able to say goodbye to her or to his two younger brothers and sisters who were killed in the gas chambers. Max and his father and his uncle were moved to Auschwitz I. Many of you may know that Auschwitz was a large complex of camps. It wasn't just a single place. There was Auschwitz I, which was a labor camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was a death camp, Auschwitz III Monowitz, which was a factory. But in fact, there was a network of hundreds of camps. And this is one of the reasons that this name resonates so much for us. There are tens of thousands of survivors of Auschwitz, of these satellite camps, of Auschwitz I, those who survived the death march, whereas the other death camps, Sobibor, Belzec, Treblinka, Majdanek, some people have never heard those names before or don't know much about what happened in those places. But in Treblinka, there were 800 to 900,000 Jews murdered in that camp and less than 50 survivors. In Sobibor and Belzec, only 2 survivors of each of those camps. So we don't have the same number of stories as we do from Auschwitz. At Auschwitz I, Max and his uncle and his father joined a labor battalion and engaged in slave labor with very little food, something that he recounts in detail in his memoir. And a couple of months after they arrived there was a selection process. This was a common practice in the camps where prisoners were selected. And in this case, Max found out that his father and uncle had been selected. He did have an opportunity, because they were in a quarantine camp, to say his goodbyes to his father. And Emil might have more to say about that later. It's a very moving moment. And then Max was on his own. He was in a labor battalion where he did forced labor, and a few weeks after his uncle and father were taken away, which incidentally he found out only 15 or 20 years ago that they were taken away for medical experimentation. He found this in the records at Auschwitz. So Max was working one day, and the capo, this was the person in charge of the prison unit, himself a prisoner, hit Max over the back of the head very hard, injured him gravely. He was bleeding a lot. He couldn't work anymore, and he was taken to the prison hospital. We know a lot about, we've heard a lot about the kinds of experimentation and those hospitals in Auschwitz I, but there were also hospitals that were run by prisoner doctors, most of them political prisoners, who actually work to triage patients who came in on a day-to-day basis. In order to make it through that process, you would have to be back up on your feet in 2 to 3 days. And after 3 days, Max was still gravely injured. He wasn't able to get back on his feet, and he was carried out on a stretcher with a group of prisoners that were bound for the gas chambers to be killed. For reasons that Max never knew, a prisoner doctor, Polish political prisoner named Tadeusz Orzeszko, pulled him off the stretcher, brought him back into the hospital, nursed him back to health, and then put him to work as a cleaner. And that's where he spent about the next 6 months until January of 1945, when the Nazis took the entire population of Auschwitz that was still mobile and put them on a death march deeper into the occupied territories. Max walked and rode in open flat cars for many days, ended up at Mauthausen. Eventually, he was moved to Melk, and finally to Ebensee camp, where he was liberated on May the 18th, May the 6th, 1945. He was liberated by a segregated unit, all African-American soldiers in a tank battalion known as the Black Panther Battalion. Like many survivors, liberation was not the end of the story. Max spent about a month in Ebensee after his liberation, healing. He eventually went back to his hometown and found that his family home was occupied by neighbors. He was not welcome there and had to leave. He went to Budapest, eventually went to Prague, obtained false papers to try to get to out of the communist side of Europe and into the American side of Europe, and was caught with his false papers and put into prison in Prague. Many of the people he was interned with were tortured and killed, but he was eventually released and then finally made his way to Canada with a visa on October 25th, 1949. So it was a long journey of 4 years until he was finally in a new place where he could start his new life. He met his wife, had 2 twin sons, Larry and Ed, and had a successful business. Eventually he became a Holocaust educator, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the evening.
Yeah, absolutely. That is such a terrific way to start us off. You've given us a really elegant outline of the book. So if anybody's joining us online or in the room, Amanda just gave us a generous gift of giving a really good overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. Emil, I understand that you talked to Max on the phone, but you might not have had a chance to meet him. Can you recall those conversations? Anything that stands out about having a chance to talk to Max?
Largely, I think it was his, as Mandy referred to, his passion for sharing this story. And I'll share a really vital line in the memoir. I was just talking about it with Mandy earlier, because it certainly sits at the center of my current draft. I'm working on a 3rd draft. And Max's father's last words to him were, "If you survive, you must tell the world what happened here." And what that spawned a thought or a phrase in my mind, how memory is both a blessing and a burden. And a huge burden in Max's case. And so when I spoke to him, I never met him in person. He passed away before we had a chance to meet face to face. But literally in his voice, there was a passion there to share the story and preserve the story for that very reason. And so that came through in terms of our conversations.
Yeah. Can you recall the moment when you first encountered Max as a figure? Was it the book itself?
It was.
it
Max lives through his memoir, if you will.
right?
Absolutely.
So tell us when did you read it? How did you find it? What happened?
Well, so you'd referenced Hannah's Suitcase, again, which was done at the Grand Theatre in London. I'm not going to go through the whole play, but it's a true story. Features a Japanese teacher named Fumiko Ishioka, who wanted to teach her children in Japan about the consequences of bullying taken to a terrible extreme. And so she said, I want these kids being kids, I want to give them something tangible. And she ended up getting a suitcase from Auschwitz. There's a museum in Auschwitz. They sent her a museum named Hannah Brady, 1605, 1931, Wiesenkind, German for orphan. I'm going to fast forward here basically, but that began a journey that she took that ultimately connected her to Hannah. Hannah was killed in Auschwitz, but had a brother who survived and ended up in Toronto. And they meet. It's a glorious story. When I teach students, when I go into classrooms to describe the process of adapting it, I often say the word Holocaust and hope are not usually words that are paired. And thanks to Fumiko, they are. So she had one of these small wings of students, and at one point Fumiko says, stories can die if there's no one to tell them. And this kid's just wrapping his mind around that. And that sort of prompted the first draft, if you will. So I was given the memoir because I had done these adaptations of Hannah's Suitcase and The Boy in the Moon. And I thought, what's the doorway into an adaptation? Because if you're going to adapt a play, there has to be something transformative in the experience of adapting it and for the audience. Otherwise, you could read Max's powerful memoir with no mediation. You and Max's words for you to absorb at your own pace in your own time. Theatrically, I want to take you to another place. So the first draft was, the doorway was, if you survive, you must tell the world what happened to her. Well, we know Max, of course, lived a long, healthy life to 93. He's no longer with us. So my first impulse was to fast forward. Imagine someone is telling Max's story 100 years from now. Who is going to tell Max's story, particularly a story about trauma, by people who have not lived that trauma? So who is going to tell Max's story? And when you retell a story, you inevitably reframe it. And how does that story become reframed? And what are the consequences of that story being reframed? In the end, that first draft, like most first drafts, was a mess, and it failed miserably. And that's okay, part of the process. And as part of the workshop process, you have actors lifting the words off the page. And one actor came to me afterwards and reminded me of one of the fundamentals of playmaking, theater making. You have to have conflict. You have to have an essential conflict that is fueling the narrative. And this applies to comedies as well. And there's no conflict in that first draft. So should I proceed to the second draft? So the second draft, okay, what's the doorway now? And Mandy, if you want to talk briefly about the videos that Max has done, you can find a lot of Max's story online. Very powerful videos of addressing students. And there's some very moving ones, interviews, news segments, I remember on The Agenda, on TVO. So I found a whole bunch of these wonderful, powerful videos. And my impulse there is, okay, where's the conflict? I would share these clips on stage as part. And by the way, from the very beginning, I saw the story being told by 7 Maxes. I call them the Maxim. 7 different actors playing Max. That itself has layers about who can tell the story and how we tell the story. That has actually continued to the latest draft. So you have these, you see these video clips, and where was the conflict? You'd see Max being interviewed by some news channel, and you've all seen these on TV, these little snippets, these sound bites, where an entire, talk about Max's trauma. At one point, I think a journalist asked, okay, so after you were rounded up, as he was by these gendarmes, and you end up at Auschwitz, what went through your mind as you stepped off the train? I'm making this up, I'm paraphrasing it, basically. So you leap from the moment he was rounded up with his family, the trauma of that, because a neighbor had told them earlier, the story, leave now, because there are people you will be rounded up. And because they were observant Jews, and this was the Sabbath, the grandfather, who was the patriarch, said, we can't leave. Lo and behold, the next morning, their lives were completely upturned. My point being, when we see these clips, we would show the clip on stage, and then one of the Maxes would say, no, wait a minute, what are you doing? You're almost violating history by trying to distill it to a 60-second sound clip. So that was draft 2. Closer, but not there yet. And then the third and Mandy's going to come in because she's been transformative, not only in Max's memoir, but in my relationship to her shaping this current draft. I'm actually going to read a little excerpt from it. If you're in the arts, you're forever begging for money. I'm used to that. So I went and I approached theater company. I said, I'm looking for funding for this project. And here I'm going to read an excerpt from this note that I wrote to this theater artist. And explains how I got to this third draft, the doorway into the most current draft. I've brought Smith, this is Clint Smith, this is an excerpt. I brought Smith into the conversation, not simply because of the power of how the word is passed, which I read a few years ago. How the Word is Passed was written by Clint Smith, a Black American poet, about this notion, same thing, how do we continue the narrative today about the trauma that happened over, well over 100 years ago. And I'd read that book on my own. I found it very moving and powerful. An article by Smith in The Atlantic last December, this is December of last year, and the podcast interviews it spawned pulled me in the midst of shaping my vision for the next draft of the adaptation. The essay is titled Monuments to the Unthinkable, followed by a subtitle, America Still Can't Figure Out How to Memorialize the Sins of Our History. What can we learn from Germany? Toward the end of the piece, Smith writes, and here's a quote from this Atlantic article, none of these projects, whether in the US or Germany, can ever be commensurate with the history they are tasked with remembering. It is impossible for any memorial to slavery to capture its full horror, or for any memorial to the Holocaust to express the full humanity of the victims. No stone in the ground can make up for a life. No museum can bring back millions of people. It cannot be done, and yet we must try to honor those lives and to account for this history as best we can. And here's the last line of this segment. It is the very act of attempting to remember that becomes the most powerful memorial of all. And then I close my pitch here. Smith's last line will gird the next draft of By Chance Alone. I'll just read it one last time. It is the very act of attempting to remember that becomes the most powerful memorial of all. So in this current draft, and it may well change by the time it makes it to the stage, I'm developing with Winnipeg Jewish Theater, is we see Max grappling with that very process of how, when he was told, if you survive, you must tell the world what happened here, where do you begin? What are you going to tell? He was there for what, how many, Mandy, 9 months? He was there from April or May of 94 till January of 1945. So that process of memory, and we know, we probably won't have time to go into tonight, but with memory and trauma, what happens to memory? And we know how it can be buried and forgotten, how we can purposely, consciously choose one memory over another. And what does that say about the memories we choose and to pass on? And this latest draft what I'm giving thought to in terms of theatricality and transforming Max's memoir is to give physical presence to memory. And as I envisage it now for draft 3, and as I just want to underscore it may change by draft 10, is a set with, again, 7 actors who all play Max. There will now be an 8th actor playing Professor Amanda Grzyb, and a whole series of boxes that you will quickly contain memory. And the inherent theatricality in that. So to have a moment on stage where Max opens the lid, peers inside, stares at it, closes the lid. That to me is the power of theater. Remember, I had a workshop earlier today, show, don't tell. In that gesture of basically saying, can't go there, too painful. And we in the audience think, what's inside that box? What's the memory that it contains? That's what I'm exploring. And once I decided to take that route, I went back, knowing that Mandy had been involved in shaping, and really instrumentally involved in shaping this memoir. But I also knew her involvement with this idea, this project that she's spearheaded, it's fair to say, project director, called Surviving Memory. I thought, how perfect to work with her, to collaborate with her as I explored this latest draft. So I called her up, and we've had wonderful conversations. And probably this time's as good as any. Or go ahead.
Well, no, I was going to intervene in one sec there just to pull Amanda's role into this a bit and,
Yes.
and just to give us some context. So I mentioned at the top of my remarks that you had met Max first on the Simon Wiesenthal Center's first inaugural trip to Poland. Now, Max mentions in his book that several people had mentioned to him before that it could be a book, but he just couldn't do it. But there was something about the meeting that you two had. There was something in the context of, he says, the stars aligned, I think is the way that he phrases it. But how did this book become a book? What was it about that meeting between the two of you that actually pulled something out of him, what Emil is talking about, unearthing this trauma? Because you were an editor, but it seems that there was something more there than just editorial work.
I don't think it was one moment or one meeting. I think it was a relationship and a friendship that was built over years. Right. So we met in Pearson Airport in 2010, embarking on a trip to Poland to visit sites of memory with a large group. I call them like the Gilligan's Island of Holocaust visitors. We had 2 mayors and 2 MPs and 2 police chiefs. It was, and I don't know. And then the survivor and the professor, I guess. And so it was a profoundly moving experience. I had been to Auschwitz-Birkenau many times, but to visit with Max and to see that exact place at the fence at Auschwitz I where he said goodbye to his father, to see the hospital where he worked with Dr. Orszeszko for 6 months, again, a place I have visited many times before, changed the way that I saw and understood the site. And we maintained a dialogue and a friendship after that trip.
Right.
Max spoke anywhere and everywhere he could to tell his story. Once he retired, speaking became his full-time job. And he spoke to school groups, he spoke at libraries, he accompanied groups to Poland, he spoke in Canada, the US. He was always getting on a plane or on a train. And in many ways, I think taking the burden of that memory on for many survivors who felt that they couldn't speak. At the same time, those stories told over and over and over again become a kind of routine. Mm-hmm. And Max had one story that he told, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit shorter, but he didn't depart too much from the same narrative each time he presented to different groups. And so speaking and writing were 2 totally different prospects.
Yeah, interesting.
He felt that as a child, he was a really bad student. He said to me probably 50 times, I can't write. I was such a bad student. I can't even put a pen to page. And so he began actually by working with a ghostwriter in Toronto who went to see him speak and wrote a first draft of a children's novella. He sent the draft to me. He said, I feel like this isn't working. And I made a lot of notes on the draft and sent it back. And he kind of set it aside. There was something kind of flat about the narrative. It captured the story, but it didn't really capture Max's experience. So more time went by. He talked more. People asked him when he would be writing a memoir. And so he approached me and asked if I could help with a new attempt at the memoir. So this was in 2012. And we began with a series of meetings and recorded interviews and conversations. And I recall at one point, these could have gone on for a long time, but I said, why don't we try to put one of these together into a chapter? Yeah. And it was the same experience. It fell flat on the page. So this is the story of the deportation from Hungary to Auschwitz. So taking what he had spoken and trying to transcribe it on the page wasn't working. So Max said, I'm going to take this back. I mean, we both agreed that it wasn't working. He said, I'm going to take this back and modify it a little bit. He went away for a weekend, and then he sent me a completely new chapter that he had written, pencil on paper, and it was beautiful. And I said, Max, you're a writer. This is really amazing. You can write. Wow. So let's make a framework. Let's start at the beginning, make sure it's not too intimidating. And we set out a framework for the memoir, and he sat and he wrote every single morning. He would fold the piece of paper in half so that it didn't look so big and empty, and then write in pencil. And then his wife or his sons would type it up and send it to me, and then I would edit the chapter and send the chapter back to him. And so there was a kind of back and forth that happened. At the beginning, I had a heavier hand as an editor, but as he wrote, like many of us, he became a much better writer through the process, and took on the feedback, moved out of the passive voice and into the active voice, as we always tell our students. And he was incredibly dedicated. Right. One of the observations that I had was how much more of the story was coming out in the written version than in the spoken version. So this was very different than the public survivor talks that he had been giving for more than a decade. He started to remember things in his dreams. For those of you who have read the memoir, the detail of where the sun was in the sky, what he was imagining in his mind, what one person said to another, his memory of the details of the names of the people who were lost is incredible. Right.
So what I find really fascinating when I was reading the memoir is how effusive Max is in his praise to you for the work that you were doing with him as an editor. But it struck me, because I know you a little bit, and I know some of the projects that you're working on that Emil had alluded to, but it strikes me that in working with Max, you as a scholar were also uncovering a new methodological process to work with somebody who had a testimony, to bear witness to them and to help them to tell their story. Would that be the case in working with Max?
Absolutely. For me, it was transformative. There were lots of colleagues. I was pre-tenure when I started the project, but just pre-tenure, I was pretty ready to go up, I guess. And I had colleagues who said, don't do it. It's not going to count for anything. This obsession we have with, publishing in the best journal and the metrics of impact, and so I started to think about impact in a different way, and to really reposition myself as a scholar, to think about research, or what research could look like if it's a form of accompaniment, where survivors, and sadly there are survivors all over the world who have these stories to tell. The survivors I'm working with in El Salvador now, we have recorded 36 testimonies of government massacres against civilians, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. There are so many of these stories to tell, and I think that academia teaches us to try to be in the spotlight, to be front and center. Right. And what does it mean if you step back and support someone else in telling their story? It can have tremendous another kind of impact.
Absolutely, and it's a editorship in a way, but there is something absolutely novel in the way that you've worked with Max. And when I read the book, I read it as underlying the entire book is a almost like letters to young scholars who want to work with people who have stories to tell, and how you brought out Max. Because there's not footnotes in the books, but you can feel your presence when you're not there helping to tell the story. To Emil, when you read the memoir, was there a moment in your playwright sensibility, was there a defining moment that when you read it, you thought, there's a play in here. There's a play that I can produce from this memoir?
I'm not so much a defining moment as the journey itself. I think, first of all, one thing, as Mandy alluded to, he had a remarkable, almost photographic memory.
Right.
And from a playwriting perspective, that's terrific, because then it just adds layers and details and color that you wouldn't otherwise have. Then I'll just take one quote. Again, I interviewed Mandy after all these transcripts. I interviewed Mandy about the process. I'm going to share a few lines from our conversation. The one was, as he wrote, he remembered more. Because remember, so much about is this grappling, again, with that line of attempting to remember that becomes the most powerful memorial at all. And I'm still exploring, but one thing that comes to mind is taking, and Mandy generously shared the transcripts of her interviews with Max. And you know how it happens with an interview, that informal, the stop, the start, you repeat words, et cetera, et cetera. And at one point he describes an episode, it's in the memoir, where Dr. Orzeszko was a Polish resistance. This guy comes in, member of the Polish resistance, and he basically induced a coma. Isn't that basically? I think that's it. He induced a coma purposely because he knew the Nazis were going to interrogate and torture this guy to get information about the resistance movement. So he consciously did that to buy time, induced this partisan member into a coma so that they could tell everyone else, leave, because it's just a matter of time before he's going to have to give up the goods. So that episode he shared with Mandy in the back and forth, the stop and start, as you would in an interview. And then as she says, as he wrote, he remembered more. And what I'm considering at this stage of the evolution of the adaptation is to contrast the conversation that he had with Mandy, describing that incident with Dr. Orzeszko, and then the final passage. Because when you hear the final passage, exactly that. As he wrote, he remembered more. Details surfaced in the writing that didn't happen in the informal conversation.
Right. So when you adapted Ian Brown's book, you did extensive interviews in addition to the book itself. Now I'm wondering, and so Ian Brown's story of taking care of his disabled child, incredibly moving book, but you interviewed Ian, his wife, the nanny, his daughter, to understand how you could put that. Was the text that Mandy and Max put together, was that the text, or are you also building around to figure out ways in which you can expand or contract the text?
That's a great question. Probably a bit of both. So there's still, I would say the memoir is the spine, if you will, in terms of the actual narrative.
Right.
But how do you tell that narrative? So at one point, Mandy had mentioned the school, he loved school visits. And I found this, and so I may even mention as much. I think Mandy said he talked how much purpose he found in sharing the story with students. He was very committed to share the story with youth. That was particularly important to him, which is why he was so open to the first rendition of his memoir being told for young adults. And one of the clips I saw was, it's online, again, it's a YouTube video. He's giving a talk, it's in Saskatoon, and a student asks, if you met, typical what a student would ask, if you met Hitler, what would you say? And Max is almost like stunned. He basically can't say anything. And the teacher who's animating the conversation goes over to him. It's a beautiful moment, and says, almost on Max's behalf, to Hitler, look at me. Look at me. And that line, I actually cracked that line open and take it many places. But that's my point about adding these additional voices that aren't in the text themselves, but serve the purpose of the memoir. Of sharing Max's story and just adding layers that weren't there in the original text.
Right, and he would eventually have the opportunity to confront one of the, I think they called him the banker, as part of the trial later in life when he,
the bookkeeper.
Thank you, the bookkeeper, right. So when Emil called you, Amanda, and said, I'm producing this as a play, what was your first impression?
I think actually it was an email from Max, was the first that I heard. So I think Max made an email introduction and said, Emil is working on a play adaptation of my memoir. Can you be in touch with him? I have been working with my wonderful colleague, Melissa Adler, on scanning all of the cards and letters that he received from students. who had seen him speak over the years. And, these cards were Max's treasures. He had banker boxes full of like every letter any student had ever written him, cards, drawings. And so he had been talking with me for a number of years, but I think the discussion got really serious in 2019 when he received an honorary degree at Western, and we had a time to talk about this project. He asked if there was some way we could digitize these materials, and so we used funding from the Faculty of Information and Media Studies, worked with a number of students to digitize this collection. And so he said, can you give Emil access to all those letters so he can see,
Oh, wow.
How the students engaged with me, what the talks meant to them. And so that was really the starting point. And that's how we got in touch. And then, phone conversations and the discussion deepened.
Just on that note, the idea of what's not in the memoir, but it's part of Max's experience. Again, I'm going to do another Mandy quote.
Great.
He said, meaning he, of course, Max, he said that he felt it was really important that he would be there to tell his story after he was gone from his physical body. And I mention that because one of the other video clips, CBC did a profile of Max going down to the USC Shoah Foundation in LA, where they are basically doing holograms. There's a hologram of Max. He was there for a week. You mentioned it was one of the most exhausting weeks of his life. I think it was 1,000 questions that they anticipate most people would ask. And you can go, I don't know if Max is online, I think it may be, but you can talk to these Holocaust survivors who are no longer with us, ask questions. And so that I will absolutely, at this point, weave into the play. Not part of the memoir, of course, but still part of that larger story of if you survive, right? You must tell the story. You must tell the world what happened, even if it's no longer you in the flesh and blood. You still have your story. So that's one of the detours I took.
So he's writing this memoir in his 80s, but he's writing it from the perspective or writing about a teenager. And I'm wondering, you have adapted Hannah's Suitcase, and that's from the perspective of a child's worldview. When you're putting this adaptation together, are there any insights from doing that perspective of the child's point of view that's helpful for thinking about how to adapt Max's story, because he's a teenager that he's writing about? It's a 70-year distance. But is that something that you're thinking right now in terms of...
And it's also the challenge, because I was continually reminded he was 15 years old when he experienced this in Auschwitz. I mean, 15. I mean, a kid to endure the trauma. So that's probably one of the challenges, is how do we remind the audience without hitting over the head, without saying every 10 minutes, oh, by the way, he was only 15. How do you suggest that maybe without words? And then you can get into the physicality of theater, because you can be 80 and still look as frightened as a 15-year-old. So one of the things we're consciously doing is have a cast that's going to be absolutely inclusive in every sense of the word, from young actors to older actors, actors of color. That raises the larger question, who can tell the story? Only an elderly Jew? I mean, we're doomed if that's the case. Then the story will not live on. So it goes back to, by the casting itself, we can address the larger issue at the heart of the story. If you survive, who will, you must tell the world what happened.
Right, and Amanda, when you were working with Max, even though it was a 70-year gap, he talks about how he went through nightmares and he had visceral reaction to, did that come out in the conversations, even though there was that gap of time for him to really vividly move back? How did you, as the person who was helping him tell his story, help him work through those? Was it friendship and trust? How did you interact with him when he was going through these moments?
Yeah, as he wrote, the memories began to surface that he had forgotten. A lot of details about his time in the camp, some details about his childhood, details about his internment in the prison in Prague after the war, and details about going back home as well. When he returned home, he knew that his family was gone, but he really hoped that he would see his dog.
Farkash.
Yes, Farkash, yeah. And so he, one of the dogs was there, but it was dying when he arrived. There were memories about the look on the face, for example, of the people who had taken over his family home. And he did start to have nightmares through the process. The more he recovered, the more I think many repressed memories were coming to the surface. And there are Holocaust scholars who work on testimony, who have acknowledged that telling one story over and over and over again can be kind of a containment of those memories, and that when you begin to tell a different kind of story, or you branch out into other memories, then it opens up those floodgates. So he remembered a lot, but there was a price, and it was a really difficult time for him. So we met in person quite frequently through that process, and we talked on the phone a lot. Max didn't like to write email messages; they were usually pretty short. But he would pick up the phone and call me sometimes every day to talk through what he was working on. So it was a very intense working relationship, and he worked really quickly. I mean, if only, I could write that quickly. He was dedicated.
Right, wow. And when you were putting it into a narrative form, because some of these feel like they would be so hard to put into narrative because there's these broken moments or interruptions in the linear story. How did you navigate the process of trying to integrate these repressed memories? Was it something that you were thinking through with Max?
We had a framework. So the framework was based on the interviews. It was chronological. And I think, one of the challenges at the beginning was that he wanted to foreshadow too much. So he wanted to say, and this was the last time I saw her, and we had to, work on pulling that back so that the reader could, experience the deaths of his loved ones as they happened, rather than knowing that, in chapter 6 or chapter 7, my aunt is going to die, or my mother is going to die. And so I think there was that initial adjustment that is different than speaking, where he could do a lot of foreshadowing with speaking. But the framework was there, and he really worked with it. And so there are certain kind of fragments of memories that I think are really powerful in the book. My favorite chapter is called A Piece of Bacon, and it's about a moment when his father is in the Canada district of Auschwitz, Auschwitz II, where all of people's suitcases and belongings were stored and sorted through by prisoners and eventually sent back to Germany by the Nazis, looted by the Nazis. And a woman gave him a piece of bacon that she found in a suitcase. Now, his father was really orthodox. He didn't want to eat the bacon because it was pork. But he did bring it back, snuck it at great risk back into Auschwitz I, and then gave it to Max. And he said, take a little bite of this every day. And Max wrapped up that piece of bacon in a cloth, and he kept it in a little hiding spot above his bunk. And then at the end of every day, when everybody was asleep, he would just take one little bite of the bacon. He couldn't necessarily place that in exact chronological time, but it's a really powerful story for a number of reasons. It was nurturing, it was sustenance, it was a gift from his father, one of the only things his father could give him. And so it comes at, I think, a perfect place in the memoir, but not necessarily following the chronological timeline that we worked out. But he just kind of he followed the path that we set out.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now that pathway for you, Emil, it might or might not work in terms of the chronology, because then you have the amplitude of a play, the time of a play on a stage, where you have the intimacy and the immediacy of the stage. How did you wrestle to balance the linearity and the chronology of the framework versus these spots of time moments, or these really important moments that surged up that you spoke about right off the top? How did you...
Still wrestling.
Still wrestling, yes. Tease that out.
Well, I'll share a little quote from an interview with Mandy earlier this year. And she said, this very much relates to chronology. And the memoir you read, which is linear, beginning, middle, and end. And she says, and so what I suggested to him was that we start with the train chapter. Let's start with the transport, because this is a really pivotal moment. And it was, of course, the train ride basically from Casa, which was where they were already in place, to Auschwitz. And so again, dramatically, that appealed to me because I thought we don't have to be linear. Nature, memory by its very nature is fragmented. So it's a matter of how, deciding which fragments, because you only have 90 minutes maybe on stage, which fragments do you choose? What's the connective thread? I'm still exploring that between them.
Right.
But certainly playing, and then do we in fact start with, if the process for Max of trying to remember was at Amanda's suggestion with the train ride, do we start on the train ride? We could. Do we start with the train ride but interrupt it? Because that's the nature of memory too. We take a detour. You can remember one thing, what was my mother wearing? And all of a sudden you take them back to a previous time where something is associated with perhaps whatever she was wearing at the time. So right now, I think theater lends itself in terms of this type of fragmented memories very, very effectively.
Right.
And how you can use lighting and sound. Same idea if we're going to use boxed memories. Because at one point I'm thinking, again, this is one image of Max just folding the yellow sheets that Mandy talked about. The power of that. Why is he folding the sheets? Because he didn't think he had enough in him to be able to fill an entire sheet. And as he's folding the sheet, we listen to music. And what's the music? This woman, Illy, who was not Jewish. Remember I talked about the gendarmes who came and knocked on the door when they were told, flee before it's too late. And she says, Edith, give me the baby, Max's young sister. Judith. And she used to play music, Chopin. It was a Chopin piece. And Max, as a child, would hear it drift through the window. And so image-wise, again, we're talking about fragments, but if we see on stage Max just folding yellow paper, and we in the audience have no idea what he's doing, and that can come out later on. And as he's folding, we hear the Chopin music that Illy played. That also can be revealed later. But to have another Max, as I said, there are 7 Maxes on stage. As he's folding the yellow sheets, another Max comes and closes the box with the memory of Illy's music, and the music stops. And we begin to associate the notion with memory and how it transports us to again, memory is a blessing and a burden, to a great moment or a horrific moment.
That's really interesting. So the memoir is so powerful, and when everybody had a chance to watch the Canada Reads process unfold, and the theme of that year was a book to move you. But I find it interesting, the question of what theater can do that a memoir can't, to bring a different kind of perspective, a new life to Max's memoir. Is that something that you're thinking about right now?
Totally. I mean, how it engages the senses in every which way. I mean, think about it. Most theater, of course, the lights go down. That's the first thing. So right away, your senses are heightened because you're in a dark room. And you can use sound. The train that tormented Max to a great. So using the sound of train towards what purpose? Not just for the sake of it. Not because Max was on a train. How are you going to use the sound of the train to further the story, to illuminate what Max went through? Right. So there's light, there's sound, there's the wordless gestures. I mean, so much can be done wordlessly in theater that I think, and just in terms of, again, the memory, things that go through my mind. You talk about the final moments. He didn't have a chance to say goodbye to his mother. He had no idea she was going to be gassed moments after that with his young sister, who she was breastfeeding on this train, and the 2 younger brothers. And so how do you, and I'm just playing with ideas, possibilities of somehow crystallizing that moment into a memory. I'm not going to go away too much, but I'm just giving thought to that. And there's ways of doing it. Right. And certainly one thing we can't do is smell. It's one of the potent ways of being transported. All of us can probably have certain smells that'll take us back to a moment in our childhood. But I'm not going to dwell on what we can't do. I will certainly focus on what we can.
Right. Amanda, when you heard that there was going to be a character in the play that represents you, did you have any thoughts on what that character should do or what they would?
I was kind of against it, to be honest. It took me a little while to come around. I don't know what to say about that.
Right. Do you have any notes for Emil right now as things are?
She said, she did make reference to Claire Danes, I think, at one point, in passing.
Yeah. I'm hoping Pedro Pascal might be in the play. I don't know.
That's fantastic. I'm going to turn to everybody in the room if you have questions in a second here, too. So if you do want to ask a question, and as well as online, if you'd like to ask questions, I see a few that I'll pull out of the chat here as well. It's fascinating, Amanda, that we touched on this a little bit earlier, that this experience of Max has been transformative for you. Can you tell us a little bit about how the experience with Max is now informing the work that you do now?
Yeah, well, a lot of the research that I'm focused on now is about documenting and commemorating the Civil War in El Salvador. So this is a project that was founded with a group of survivors in Chalatenango, group that was heavily impacted by government violence from 1980 to 1992. And that project emerged just as we were finalizing the page proofs of Max's memoir.
Wow.
So as the project with Max was coming to a completion, I was beginning to work on the very beginnings of the project in El Salvador that has grown exponentially. So we work with funding from Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, the Ontario Research Fund, and also generous contributions from Western and all of our partners, with 22 partners, 36 co-applicants and collaborators, and hundreds of community collaborators who are working on projects ranging from recording testimonies of massacres, mapping precise locations of massacres in Chalatenango, but now moving into other departments in the country. We're working with a team of architects from Belgium and El Salvador that are designing through a co-creation process memorials at some of those sites, and also working on 2 community museums. Well, now 3. We're also working with the Salvadorian Canadian Association here in Canada to document the stories of migration from El Salvador to Canada. Most came as refugees in the mid to late 1980s. So a lot of what I think I learned from Max about the importance of testimony and taking the time to build relationships to facilitate that storytelling has really been, I think, refined and also scaled up in what is a very, very large project.
That's gorgeous. Gorgeous in terms of just how the project can trace to those experiences that you had. Unbelievable.
And the other thing I would mention is that there is a strong mental health component in the project. So we're working with community health promoters, psychologists, psychiatrists, to make sure that all of the work we do is trauma informed and really meeting the needs of communities. And I think, that's something else that I learned from working with Max and watching him go through that process of storytelling, that yes, it can be very healing, but it can also be really triggering.
Right.
And I think, we need to be able to, and it can be both. And so I think we need to be able to attend to that and make sure that is incorporated into all of the work that we do.
Right, and there's a question in the chat from Ola. Are there parts of Max's story that he shared with you but could not share with an audience because the memoir or the memories were too painful? Are there boundaries to what could be remembered or shared in the memoir?
I would say yes, but then should I reveal those? That's a bit of a question.
Right.
I think when Max spoke publicly, he really felt an obligation to try to have a hopeful message at the end of every talk. But I don't think he always felt, so much hope when he saw everything that was going on around him. So I think that's something that all public survivors really have to balance. The objectives of talking and sharing the story and hoping that it can diminish instances of violence, promote healing and reconciliation and peace, because the story is a universal one in many ways. But I think it can be hard to tell that story year after year after year and see violence happening all around us.
Right, and somebody in the chat noted that as well and was contemplating how he would feel about what's happening right now. Emil, you've said third draft. What's the expected draft number, and where's you mentioned the is it Manitoba, Winnipeg Jewish Theatre? What's the timeline right now? Are we going to see the play coming to the Grand Theatre?
I hope so, but if all goes well, it's a long. The gestation period for plays is a long time. So now I'm heading to a third draft. And it's slated, if all goes well, to premiere at the Winnipeg Jewish Theatre in spring 2025. And then, of course, we have to lay the groundwork for what we hope will be a tour. Because of part of the universality, I go back to Clint Smith, the Black American poet who wrote a book about slavery and how he was so affected by the Holocaust memorials in Germany. And how it's in the specificity, of course, that there's an element of universality in terms of trauma and memory.
Right. And there's a question in the chat, too, of how you move back and forth between the 7 Maxes. How does the transitions work? How do they all interact with each other?
But in a way, it's all Max. So it's just a matter of deciding who's going to say what. But that's the conceit at this point. I may have one way it's migrated is that there may be one central Max, if you will, Max number 1. And I'm doing that part because I had a concern with previous drafts. If we have 7 actors playing Max, by the way, it could be females. It's, as I say, this is diversity in every sense of the word. If that we had 7, there are certain moments, and I read it, that I wanted to resonate. And there was a part of me that realized if we have 7 that are on the same level, if you will, that may prevent us from investing in one Max. And once we invest in one particular Max, they're all Maxes. That may give it more weight that I was searching for. So that's what I'm exploring now. But there will be 7, so it's anything they say, it's Max speaking. And they may even speak to each other, of course, because we have internal conversations with ourselves all the time. And so that could be an interesting conversation where we have 2 memories almost, or Max is discussing, do we share this memory? Do we go there? Because there's some stuff that's really painful in the memoir.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any questions in the room? Yes, absolutely. Wait for me to give you a mic so that people online can hear the question. Sorry, online people, as I move this, a little gurgling.
Strictly aside from Max's story and all those details, I'd like to ask Amanda about the academic side. It was mentioned here in the conversation that at the time you started working with Max, that you were in a pre-tenure kind of a position, I presume here at Western. Now that we've had a few years go by and the book's published and Max's story is well known, has it helped your academic standing, your academic career, your academic path to have been involved in this process, or has it just been a sidelight for you?
I'm a professor in a really open and generous faculty, and I think there's been an appreciation for the work. I think the biggest impact has been how it's influenced the project that I'm working on in El Salvador, which is a really large-scale project. So I think there has been a transition, a process of learning, but I don't know that it has directly. I'm not even sure. I'm not sure how to answer that question. Yeah, it has been. I think there's a recognition of the book, and as I said, I feel really supported within my own faculty. But I think the truth of academia is that there's a lot of focus on building up the individual researcher, and in an increasingly neoliberal university that promotes that kind of scholar. And I think the more work that we can do collaboratively and collectively, and to promote the careers of younger scholars and graduate students, and to engage with communities, the more we're going to open up the university to all of those people around us. So for me, that's really essential.
That's really, I like that question a lot, and I have a follow-up one too, because Max is so big on intergenerational conversation. You hear in the book all the time that people felt worried for him, except the fact that he was surrounded by Jewish children who are the Jewish future, I think was the phrase at one point in time. And I strike that parallel with you, Amanda, as well, that you're learning a new process of engaging, and now you're sharing that with a new generation of scholars. So as you're teaching graduate students and younger researchers, are there things that you learned that you're helping them learn along the way as well, and passing along some of the lessons that Max taught you in that work that you did with him?
I think, the generosity of time and space and working in a collaborative mode has really informed the way that I worked with graduate students. There's like one or two of them here that, might beg to differ. But I think, I think that I consider Max to be a mentor, and I think that mentorship is really important in engagements between students and faculty.
Right. Any other questions in the room? Yeah.
Thank you both, Amanda and Emil. A question for you, Emil, is about the character of Amanda, or the one based on her. If Mandy doesn't want to answer the question, I hope you don't mind if Emil answers that question. And for you, Amanda, you said that it's a universal story, and there's a sense in which it surprised me to hear you say that. And although I can imagine the ways in which it is a universal story, could you say more?
And the question was how I integrated the Amanda. Yeah, that came to me partly because it's a wonderful opportunity to have that voice. Because, as I say, I share some of the lines because she becomes a doorway into this notion of memory. Partly because of how instrumental she was shaping Max's memoir, and very much about her work in El Salvador. And so I found I really valued her insights and her perspectives because she is so uniquely positioned to wade into the world that Max was basically trying to articulate and give form to. And so I immediately thought it would be terrific to have her. She didn't exist in the first two drafts at all, of course. And then you also have that element of contrast as well, and she even revealed as much, where she talked about even Max's reluctance. That's not gonna be nowhere. I mean, Max refers to his being a bad student, but he never talks about it in the context of his memoir. He just said, I wasn't a very strong student. I'll just see if I can find, there are a couple of lines here. It was just so, he said that he felt, so much of his, again, you're not gonna find this line in the memoir. That's bringing Mandy into the play itself. So much of his conception of himself as a bad student was holding him back from actually picking up a pencil. That in itself is a theatrical image. Again, I'll just say, again, it's worth repeating. So, and then this is not a memoir. So Max says, I was a bad student. And he talks about the experience and et cetera, and his father, I think, may have beat him because he felt he wasn't, or certainly, very harsh with him, not living up to the student he thought he should be. And then a character, certainly, or Mandy, this line may make it into the play. So much of his conception of himself as a bad student was holding him back from actually picking up a pencil. That speaks to the heart of memorializing. I mean, the idea of a memoir. And it begs the question, how many other people in this world who have stories to tell, memoirs and trauma, held themselves back because they had been convinced and told, you're not worthy to tell this story. And the tragedy of that, the untold stories of people who just didn't feel they had the right, if you will. Well, then everyone has the right to tell a story. And so I think Mandy's voice in the play will be instrumental in just unpacking those concepts and those I say that entryway into the memoir that wouldn't have been there otherwise. All we would have heard is Max saying, I was a bad student. And now we have a voice saying, and that held you back. And subtext is, what's the price we would have paid if he had never picked up that pencil? I think it's a high one. And all the others who picked the pencil, like the Clint Smiths of the world. I mean, it's on and on and on in terms of the stories that need to be told. And how many are so reluctant to tell the story because they don't think they're worthy of it. And conversely, many people, of course, take up too much oxygen by telling stories because they feel they do have the right to tell it. And there's only so many trees we can fell for memoirs.
So I think, Lisa, obviously this is a really particular historical moment in time. There is, a singularity to his experience in some ways, but I think in listening to Max's stories over so many years, and particularly rereading the memoir, which I do from time to time, there are particular moments that seem to me to be tremendously universal about human experience, about caring for others in a time of tremendous trauma and horror. And so I'll read you one short section. This is one of my favorite moments in the memoir. So this is a moment when Max is on the death march, and they have been moved onto flat cars on their way to Mauthausen. And at this point in the previous pages, he has described people who are dropping dead in the cars, how riding in the cars is actually worse than walking because they're exposed to the snow and the cold. They have to stand. They're not, making warmth with their bodies any longer. The number of people who die and how they're removing the clothes from those bodies and putting those clothes on to stay warm so that they can survive this transport. And so he's just described, one of the most horrific moments among many horrific moments in the memoir. And then he writes, as the skies became lighter in the morning, wet snow came down and I could make out the name Pilsen on the railway station. This told me that I was back in occupied Czechoslovakia. I began to feel more hopeful when I heard a commotion several cars behind us. I saw that there was a bridge extending over the railway tracks just down the line, and on the bridge there were several people throwing chunks of bread into the flat cars below. The SS guards yelled out, "Don't throw bread, these are Jews," but the people ignored them. Finally, the guards sprayed the bridge with their submachine guns and the people ran away. Although I was too far away to receive any bread, the actions of these people nurtured me nonetheless. Knowing that there were still kind and caring people in the world boosted my spirits and gave me new life. So this moment where he doesn't receive a piece of bread, but even knowing that there are people risking their lives throwing bread into the cars, that this gives him life, that it nurtures him the way that food would, to me is a really universal passage.
It's a beautiful moment that really does stand out. I wish I had a feed on a screen of all of the effusive comments that are coming through the chat of people. It's a wonderful collection of individuals, and everybody has stayed with us the whole time. This is amazing. A question for Emil. Emil talked about plays needing conflict. Will the conflict provided by the 7 Maxes be disagreement about what happened, contested memories?
Absolutely. I mean, that happens, the very nature of memory. And even in our own lives, you have a memory and you think, did that happen? Or is that how I imagine it happened? Like you have almost a memory of a memory. So I definitely think there's room. In fact, I will absolutely explore the idea of, so in other words, Max will be having, when we have 7 Maxes, it's like an internal conversation. And absolutely, did it happen? And you have, and that, because in a way, the idea of to what degree do we trust memory? I mean, it gets into really, really interesting territory. And what do we process? At one point, Max, very early when he was in Auschwitz, he at one point says that there's a passage where he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing it, I forced myself to stop remembering. I mean, even that line, this is at 15. So to explore that, and the other thing I should mention about the Max is that they also get, this is memory too. These 7 actors who are all Max get to play other people's who are the memories coming to life. So you can have the members, people who play Max become the people on the train as they're heading to Auschwitz. Maybe you'll have one of them who's not Jewish throwing the bread to the train, because that's what we do. We're the directors of our own memories. We orchestrate our memories. We people are memories, and in that sense, I think having a multiple cast of Maxes, they also can play the memories brought to life because they're all internal.
Right. Amanda, when you were working with Max, did you feel the presence in these conversations of potential 7 Maxes and different memories that were competing in the way that he was telling his story on those conversations that he would call you?
No, I would say no. I wasn't imagining 7 Maxes, but I do think there are particular moments of transformation. His pre-war life, the experiences in Auschwitz, the experience well, he was in Ebensee for another month, and then spent about 3 months healing in Marienbad. He was imprisoned, as I mentioned earlier, and then eventually was in a displaced persons camp. So, 4 months of transience, in which there was a lot of growth and a lot of healing. and then the new birth, the new life in Canada. And this is something we commonly hear with the El Salvador Project as well, that those refugees who migrated from El Salvador to Canada in the 1980s describe their arrival here as a kind of rebirth. So I don't know if does that equal 7? I mean, I think Emil's conceiving of it in a different way.
Oh, yeah.
Although I do think, the layers of memories and the way that the memory came out through the writing process certainly lends itself to different levels of memory and experience.
And you can have Max observing himself in a situation, right? Because now you get to really get into the layers. So if he's remembering at one point, again, it's called By Chance Alone, the randomness of it all. In a place called Milk, they discovered some conveyor belt and somebody had cut out almost like sandal type shoes. And of course they decided, well, we're going to take they lined them up and every 10th person is going to be taken out and shot in the head, basically. So Max was not one of those 10s.
Right.
And so to be able to watch, so we can have a moment where Max is watching himself as part of those 10 people. You know what I'm trying to say? You can actually see yourself within a memory. That's why we're exploring. It may end up being a one-person show at the end, by draft 10. But that's the nature of storytelling as well, to explore and see, is it working, is it not? And
I find it so fascinating. No, I asked Amanda in absolute good faith, and just seeing how, the creativity of it, it's really fascinating to me. A question, so earlier today, Emil very generously had a workshop with community playwrights. Some of them were here in the room. One is online and is asking a question prefaced by a remark that they'd had a chance to meet Max and found him a remarkable person. But the question is for Emil, how are you going to know that the right draft is the right draft?
Do you ever know? And it's funny because in that very workshop today, we have some people who were there. We were going over how you adapt a story for the stage. And today, I actually realized, you know what? I made a mistake, not a mistake. Moving this line on one page to another, on that same page lower, just changed the dynamic of that particular scene. I'm going to change it moving forward. So in other words, do you ever know? There comes a point where you probably think it's as good as it can be at this point, because that could become a crutch too. It's not ready, right? Any type of artistic pursuit can become a crutch. Well, I'd love to share, but I need one more draft. There comes a point where you think I've gone as far as I can. It's almost internal. You know you've given your all, and you let go, flaws and all. This will not be a flawless play, I know that, and that's okay. But the one advantage of theater, unlike almost any form of storytelling, is it is fluid. So I can change, this is The Boy in the Moon. I can make that one small change because of this workshop today, that moving forward will be in all future productions of The Boy in the Moon. Think about that. I can't think of any other form of storytelling where that can be done. Usually a painting is a painting. You're not going to go and repaint a painting with hanging in a gallery 5 years later. Film is locked in. A book, yeah, you can put an additional chapter online, but it's not the same experience. But the play will be, those modifications. That's what I love about live theater, how it's so fluid.
Right. Any questions in the room? Well, I've got one in the chat here, and it's a great follow-up for Amanda. What effect does their storytelling, the people you're working with in El Salvador, have on the Salvadorans who share their trauma, and how does your team deal with that? For that matter, how do you deal with the stories and Max's horrors yourselves?
So the project in El Salvador was conceived of by the survivor community, in particular a group called Asociación Sampul, which represents massacre survivors in Chalatenango. And we have worked very slowly to relationship build between many different kinds of colleagues. So our team includes artists, architects, scholars, community leaders, social movement leaders, survivors, youth, mental health professionals, and we develop the research and execute the research and finish the research through workshops. So we're always sitting together in circles and working with the community to develop projects that meet their needs, and we work at their pace on the projects that are important to them. So one of the preoccupations of the survivor community in Chalatenango was to document the sites of now close to 70 community identified massacres. Only a few of them are mentioned in the United Nations Truth Commission document because of lack of space. They heard 22,000 complaints of violence, but they could only highlight some of the key cases. This was a Truth Commission report published in 1993, just after the peace accords were signed. And so it is really important to the survivors that those massacres, and this is only in one department, like one province of the country, we have now 70 community identified massacres. It's important that we have precise documentation of those places. So we work with a GPS team here at Western Libraries. We hike into remote locations. We get very precise within the sub-meter, usually 3 to 4 centimeters accuracy location for massacre sites. And then if the survivors wish, we film video testimonies at the site. Most of them choose to do that. And then we have an interactive map in which you can click on a point, have the name of the survivors, the name of the massacre, the date, the name of the perpetrators, whether justice has been served in the case. And in every case, sadly, the answer is no, it has not been. And this is a really important intergenerational tool for the Salvadorian community, and then also the broader international community. So that's a long answer to say that the projects are conceived of and driven by the needs of the communities. The stories are difficult to tell, but we make sure that we always have mental health professionals there at every workshop, at every event, every commemoration. And I think establishing memorials and plaques at all of these sites is a really important step and a form of restorative justice that is very important to the community and a priority for them.
And if anybody's interested to hear further, there's a Western News article that documents some of this work that you've been doing. I think it was last week that's in the Western News. So if you Google it, folks at home right now, I would Google it for you right now, but we can do that and send that to you on an email later. Emil, on that point, do you think is there mourning work? Is there restorative justice work? Is there what's the work of theater when we take on some of these hard, difficult topics and we bring them to the stage? When you're writing and when you're conceiving of these plays, how do you think it's going to work with the audience in that interaction?
What I would hope for, I'm a little bit wary of sort of any art that says I have the answer. And so what I would hope is if any type of, particularly a play, of course, in this instance, can spark questions. So if an audience member just leaves with questions, and that, because of course one question begets another question. I mean, in terms of both, how can this happen? How did it happen? And then you can go, apply it in many different contexts. So I would hope that in terms of not so much the mourning itself, but as I say, just giving thought to just peeling back the layers of any story and asking, how do we get to this point? And I think asking also questions that challenge us. I think theater, and I'd mentioned this earlier, if I do a play and 200 people see the play, 4 or 5 leave and something has shifted within in ways that you may not even be conscious of. And that goes with even teaching, of course, the same idea. I often think there's certainly there's threads that connect theater and a classroom. I mean, you can think of the stage, you have an audience, you have a prof, and you have students sitting in chairs, you have actors on stage, an audience, and I think there's a similar connection where this constant question, I think, is really what I would hope for. And the questions that are challenging.
Brilliant. Well, I want to thank everybody who joined us online. I have to say the 7 Maxes is a huge hit in the chat, by the way, as is Amanda being a part of the play. So I think you might be overruled by the chat that you're going to be in the play. I thank everybody who joined us here in Conron Hall at Western University. Thank you so much, Amanda Grzyb and Emil Sher, for diving into challenging, difficult, rewarding, amazing work that you're doing here at Western, and the work that you're doing right now with the Winnipeg Jewish Theater to produce this play. We are also in the chat anticipating the release of this play, and I'm sure you'll have a huge audience from the folks that joined us tonight. And thanks so much to Greg, who's doing our videography, to take us live. He's behind the scenes, but he does so much work to bring Western's research and Western's researchers and our amazing guests to all of you at home so that you can enjoy this with us. Thank you. Join me in thanking Amanda and Emil.
Thank you.